Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Penn Vicarage and to our Bible talk on this beautiful sunny Wednesday morning. Looks like a wonderful day for golf this morning, and I shall certainly find out in a few minutes' time. Hope you have a lovely day, and it's great to see you, and hello on this Wednesday morning. Friends, we are working our way through the letter of Paul to the Romans. It's tough stuff, but I hope you agree with me, it's worth it. There's some wonderful, wonderful stuff in Romans, and I hope you're enjoying it. This morning's passage, they say, don't they, at parties, you don't talk about politics or religion. Well, this morning we're talking about both, because here we have one of the most famous passages in, if not the most famous passage in the Bible, all about what to do about state and rulers and authorities and that sort of stuff. So, without further ado, I shall tell you what Paul says. Romans, I keep saying 1 Corinthians, Romans chapter 13, I'm reading verses 1 to 7. Here goes. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. If you wish to have no fear of authority, then do what's good, and you will receive its approval, for it's God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It's the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be subject not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what's due to them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honour to whom honour is due. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, Paul is talking here about rulers and authorities and governments and that sort of thing. And I think he says some quite important things to us this morning. Firstly, he talks about government in general. He says government is God-given. It doesn't mean you have to, some governments aren't better than others, doesn't mean that you've got to always be in favour of the particular people in the time, but it does mean that as a generic point, government is good because government is God-given. Paul is quite clear that government, having structures and rulers and authorities, is a generic point that is God-given. So it's a good thing. So because it's God's given, it is a good thing. Secondly, it's important because it gives us order rather than chaos. I'm afraid for Christians, anarchy is not an option. Order and law and this and society has to have ways it does things. Otherwise, there is chaos, and that's not good. So, rules, authorities are good because they're God-given, and also because it gives us order when there'd otherwise be chaos. The other reason why it's good is because, generally speaking, law and order protects the weak against the strong. Clearly not always, and we can have a long discussion about that, but as a generic point, generally speaking, law and order protects the weak against the strong. So for all sorts of reasons, Paul is saying here this morning that government is a good thing. He's not saying all governments are or some better than others or whatever, but he's saying as a generic point that government is a good thing because it's God-given, because it creates order rather than chaos, and because generally speaking, it protects the weak against the strong. So, what should our response be as Christians because of this? He says, firstly, yes, we have to pay our taxes. And it's interesting in that one, it's almost certainly thought that he had the words of the Lord Jesus in his passage. Unusual passage because Jesus never gets mentioned, but actually Jesus did say, render to Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God which is God's. And it's thought that when he talks here about paying taxes to those in authority, Paul may have had the words of Jesus in his head as he said it. So what should we do? We should pay taxes. We also believe that we should be good Christian citizens. We should be good citizens, and that we should, generally speaking, we should obey the laws. So if we do get in trouble with the state, if the Christian church does come up against the state, it shouldn't be for bad behaviour. It should be if we do, we do. But generally speaking, we should be good citizens. So we should keep to the laws, and we should be good, trustworthy, law-abiding citizens. Quite clear about that. I believe, thirdly, that we should also take a proper part in society. I think it's important that Christians should be in politics, and Christians should be involved in the workings of a good society. I'm very proud of the fact, actually, that we have 5 local councillors, 5 Wolverhampton councillors, regularly attending our church. I'm really proud of that. And we pray for them regularly, and I'm glad we do. And I'm really proud, from both of the main parties, that I think it's really important that actually I'm proud of the fact that we have 5 councillors regularly worshipping in our church. I think that's really, really important. We should do that. And also, I believe that it means that we should vote, that we should take part in elections, and that we should, get involved in society, and we should do good things like, we should take part in community projects. That we should, as I say, we should vote, and all sorts of things. So we've established so far that government is, generally speaking, government generically is a good thing. That it's God's given, that it creates order out of chaos, and generally protects the weak against the strong. And as Christians, that we are called by quite clear in the passage this morning to pay taxes. That we should be good citizens, and we should be law-abiding and so on. That we should take part in society. That we should play our part in government, but also we should be in the police and the health service and so on. That as Christians, we should be right in the teeth of it where things are in society, and that also that we should vote and we should play our part and speak out where necessary. Now, it all sounds all tickety-boo so far, if only it was that simple. But I hear you saying, not all governments are good, and there are some very nasty governments across the world, and there always have been. What do you do if you find yourself happen to be unfortunate enough to be born in Hitler's Germany or whatever it may be? And there are to this day some vile governments across the world, and are corrupt and so on. And what do we do then? What does it mean then to, as Paul says, to submit to those in authority? Well, I think firstly to say that Paul knew what you were talking about when we say that, because let's not forget, Paul was writing here to the Romans. Paul was writing to the church in Rome, the great Babylon, the beast in Revelation. So did he know what he was talking about? Yes, he did, because Paul was writing in the midst of to Christians in Rome who were going through exactly that at the time. And he knew exactly what he was talking about. There are, of course, also times when to obey the state means to go against God. And 'twas always the case. And sometimes states and rulers and governments demand of us things that as Christians we simply cannot do. And likewise, and where we have a choice between doing what the state says and what God tells us to do. And that was always the case. For example, Daniel in the lion's den. The book of Daniel is important because actually he and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel lived in the country of Babylon at the time, which was they've been taken to exile, and they knew what it's like to live under a dodgy regime. And there are times, as Daniel found, when to obey the state means to disobey God, and we all have that sort of stuff, and that happens from time to time as well. But I think what Paul says is quite interesting. He does not tell us to obey those in authority. Instead, he tells us to submit to those in authority. That's quite important. It means that, generally speaking, we should do what they say. But when it comes to the time when we have to put God first or the state first, then God has to come first, as Daniel did. But submit also means that we pay the consequences of that we don't kick and scream and all that sort of stuff. But actually, there are times where we have to say no. When someone said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." When there are times when to obey the state means to go against God. Often in Roman times, they had to burn incense to some Roman god or something, and the Christians felt they just couldn't do it. And because of that, to obey the state in that case was to go against God. And Christians do find themselves in that position sometimes. But I think, generally speaking, it means that we submit. It means we give honour to those in authority, and we do respect the state. But when we can't do it, because Christian conscience forbids it, then we have to pay the consequences for that. And Christians often have done throughout history as well. This is big, and it's a very, very complicated subject, and answers on a postcard. And many courses, many debates, and a heck of a lot of PhDs have been written about exactly what this means. So to sum up, what Paul tells us about authorities and rulers this morning, because it's a complicated subject, and I don't know how I could possibly do it in 10 minutes. I've barely scratched the surface, but I've done my best in a short time. What does Paul tell us? He tells us that government, generically speaking, is a good thing, that it's God-given, that it creates order out of chaos, and generally speaking, protects the weak against the poor, protects the weak against the strong. What should we do? Quite clearly, we should and we must pay our taxes, that we should be good citizens, we should obey the laws of the land, that we should take part in society, and as I said, we should pray for those in our congregations and so on, and we should play part in the police and so on, that which is important that we do that, and that as church we pay for them, and also we do good things like we vote in society as well. We should be good Christian citizens. But acknowledging the fact that sometimes government is bad, and that sometimes there are some pretty nasty regimes across the world, and what do we do then? Recognising, of course, that Paul was writing to Romans when he wrote this, and recognising that there are times when to obey the state means to disobey God. And what Paul tells us here is to submit, which means that we, generally speaking, we do what the state says. But when supporting the state means going against God, then we have to put God first. But in that case, because we submit, we have to pay the consequences of that. Tricky passage, lots to think about. Meditate on it today. Read the passage yourself. You may